We have Bob Stefanowski, Mark Boughton, Steve Obsitnik, David Stemmerman, and Tim Herbst. We had the candidates draw numbers to determine the order of today's debate and where they would stand. And the first question will now go to Bob Stefanowski. Mr. Stefanowski, thanks for being with us today. According to federal data, for the 15 years after Connecticut passed the income tax, Connecticut's economy actually grew strongly, faster than many other states, faster than the nation, in fact. Only since 2008 has the economy suffered. Given that history, why would cutting or reducing the state income tax help Connecticut recover?
Well, Dennis, thanks for that question. I think the more relevant question is before 1991, when the income tax was put in, Connecticut was the fastest growing state in the entire nation. And since that time, we're slowest in economic growth. Our roads and bridges are deteriorating. Connecticut is the perfect example of a failed economic policy. That's why I'm the only candidate up here who says two things. Number one, we will eliminate the state income tax. And number two, I've signed a pledge as governor to never raise taxes for the state of Connecticut. You're going to ask, how do we pay for it? We have to cut cost. We have to resize government. We have to renegotiate the state employee agreement. We have to look at our entitlement programs. We have to reprioritize. And we have to take a fiscal disciplined approach. But we have to get the tax rate down on the hardworking taxpayers of Connecticut.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Boughton, you have 1 minute.
Sure. I think when you look at when the income tax was passed in 1991, if you look prior to that, as mentioned, you'll see that economic growth was a boomtown here in the state of Connecticut. If you look after 1991, you'll see that our growth has been anemic at best. And depending who you talk to, what economist, depends on what their view is. We really didn't have any economic growth. But here's what we do know. When we look at the data for states the 8 states that do not have an income tax, they have been way more successful than the state of Connecticut at attracting people, at growing business, and attracting investment to their community. The beauty of Connecticut prior to 1991 was that we did not have an income tax. It allowed people to come here, to put a flag here, and to say, this is where I want to live. We were a little bit cheaper than New York City and than Boston. So we need to work on a plan, and we have a plan to slowly phase out the income tax over 10 years.
Thank you, Mr. Boughton. Mr. Obsitnik, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Look, let's talk over the last 8 years. Dan Malloy has inflicted the 2 largest tax increases this state has seen. And we see 100 people a day are evicted from Connecticut and have to move somewhere else to find opportunity. So look, I think it's a bunch of nonsense talking about getting rid of the income tax. It's 50% of our revenue. As an engineer, a military veteran, and a business CEO, I'll tell you straight what it is. I believe in targeted tax reform. I believe in hugging seniors and getting rid of the estate tax, taxation on pensions and Social Security, reducing the tax on middle-class workers who make $100,000 or less, and phasing out the corporate and business entity tax over 3 years. I want to hug the customers of Connecticut, seniors, businesses, and working folks, to say you can live here, because we have a crisis of confidence in this state right now. The conversation around every dinner table is how are you getting out of Connecticut and when are you getting out of Connecticut, or don't come back to Connecticut. I want to change that crisis of confidence to a Connecticut of confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Stemmerman, you have 1 minute.
Dennis, like you, I grew up in Massachusetts, and when I grew up there, it was called Taxachusetts, and it was losing families and businesses just like we are today. I started a business myself from a single desk, and so I know that when your price is too high, you're going to be losing your customers, and our tax rate is our price. When we're losing people 5 out of the last 6 years, when we have the same number of jobs as we did in 2008, something is wrong, and I view that our price is simply too high. But having a realistic plan for reducing our taxes is going to be critical. We can't cut a cent of taxes unless and until we restructure our retirement liabilities and our contracts to do that. And I'm the only candidate in either party that's said how we're going to do that. I also have a detailed tax proposal on my plan that's been endorsed by the Hartford Current, is saying we're the only one that has done the math, has a bold and achievable plan.
Mr. Herbst.
Dennis, what this comes down to is that revenues cannot keep up with expenses, and the unfunded liabilities are continuing to create a deficit that people's incomes cannot sustain. Now, we can talk about eliminating and cutting taxes, but unless and until we deal with this 800-pound gorilla, that's never going to happen. Now, let me just say this. Every candidate on this stage should want to eliminate or cut taxes, but you have a moral obligation to tell voters how you're going to do it. We're 6 days away from a primary election. The two candidates that are advocating for elimination of the income tax have not told us how they're going to do it. And I should also point out, I am not in favor of eliminating taxes to create or increase others. The CCM plan that was commissioned by the executive board when Mayor Boughton was the chair called for a plan that would result in a $900 million tax increase and $2.6 billion in new spending. I am not in favor of creating regional taxes or additional taxes or increasing existing taxes in the name of eliminating other taxes, because at the end of the day, it is coming from the same source, which is the wallets of the taxpayers of Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Stefanowski, you have 1 minute for rebuttal.
Thank you, Dennis. You know, it's always fascinating to me that people tell me we can't do something that we've already done. The state lived perfectly fine without a state income tax in 1991. Texas has done it. Florida has done it. Tennessee has done it. What people are tired of in our state are people telling them, their leaders telling them what can't be done. People want to hear what can be done. We can absolutely get rid of this income tax over 8 years. We need to cut cost. We need to drive efficiency. We can use those tax savings to stimulate the economy, create jobs, and bring back growth. Dan Malloy has done the exact opposite. Despite massive tax increases over the last 8 years, tax revenues are down. So first of all, we've done it before. People want leadership, somebody that can do it. And it's common sense that we need to do the opposite of what Dan Malloy has been doing to this economy for 8 years. We can absolutely turn Connecticut around, Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Our next question is from Mr. Boughton and comes from Angela.
Mr. Boughton, you're talking about making the state more competitive, the ability to attract businesses, and you're blaming the state's business climate for losing jobs, losing companies. And yet, when you look to the two states closest to us, New York and Massachusetts, as you've noted, they managed to snag two of iconic companies in Connecticut, Aetna and GE, and they have they also are high-tax states. They have higher minimum wages. They have tolls. So what accounts for your insistence that Connecticut's business climate is detrimental to attracting businesses?
Well, there's a couple of things that make it detrimental to coming here. Number one is the attitude that the governor has, and the legislature has in some cases, to new businesses and to investment. So when you have that reputation across the United States of America and really across the globe as being the place not to go to, then obviously investment won't come here. So the first thing I'm going to do as your next governor is I'm going to repair the business relationships that happen here in the state of Connecticut.
Can you give an example of why you think there's a bad relationship between the state and business?
I'm getting there. Well, I don't think the governor has done a lot to reach out. I think there's always discussion at every legislative session of how we can pick the pocket of businesses again over and over and over again. And so people hear that and they leave. Our unfunded liabilities are a scary thing for businesses that want to come here to say, hey, I've got to get out of Connecticut. I don't want to get stuck with this huge bill. It also takes us an extraordinarily long time to approve permits. And so under my administration, we're going to have an expedited permit system.
Mr. Obsitnik, you have 1 minute.
Look, I think a lot of your viewers and business owners are on the other side of the call to the letters from the Department of Labor, the Department of Environmental Protection, and they understand what a hostile environment is to working from a business standpoint. So people make decisions with their feet, and they'll move businesses across the border. Even how we tax businesses on pass-through entity. You're better to go to Massachusetts than stay in Connecticut. But that's why I think we need a big vision to come together as a state. That's why I'm not talking about eliminating a tax specifically. I talk about a 5-step plan to building 300,000 jobs over the next 8 years. 5 + 3 = 8. It's that vision we need to come behind around targeted tax reform for people, seniors, working folks, and businesses. It talks about $3.5 billion in detailed definitive spending cuts, and it talks about building career corridors in Connecticut. From Hartford to New Haven, Groton to Greenwich, we have 42 trade schools to universities, and we have 24 Fortune 1000 companies who have not evicted themselves yet, like GE and Alexion. We just need a governor who's going to be the Chief Economic Development Officer for the state of Connecticut.
Mr. Stemmerman.
I launched my campaign in March in Fairfield, outside the former headquarters of GE. And I asked them, why did you leave? And why did you leave, to your point, to Massachusetts, not Florida or Texas? And the first thing they said is that our tax environment is simply unstable. With these massive unfunded retirement liabilities, the state came to us each year proposing a new tax, and we were worried that it could go higher and higher every year. But they said other things too. They said our location next to New York wasn't as beneficial anymore because the trains were too slow and the roads were too slow. They said, in addition, that we couldn't get the skilled employees that we need here, people with STEM skills. And the last thing that they said is our taxes were too high. When we have the land of Elizabeth Warren with lower income taxes than us, we know we've got a problem. We attracted businesses and families here with that three-legged stool, our great location, strong schools, and affordability. That's the formula that we need to get back to.
Thank you. Mr. Herbst.
We are losing to states like Massachusetts and New York because businesses see the fiscal volatility that is in Connecticut. Let's remember something. Over the course of the last decade, this state has been in sustained and protracted deficit, structural deficit, with a deficit that continues to grow. And that deficit grows because of these unfunded liabilities that continue to consume more and more of the state budget. So candidates that promise you the sun, the moon, and the stars in terms of eliminating taxes have an obligation to tell you how we're going to dig out of this $86 billion hole. Truly balance our budget, reduce the cost of living, tackle the regulatory environment to make it easier for businesses to set up shop here, grow here, and make the long-term commitment here, and how we're going to fund infrastructure improvements, which are critical to growing our economy. Businesses and entrepreneurs and job creators are not going to want to set up shop here in the state of Connecticut when their employees are spending 2.5 to 3 hours a day going to and from work, and when they're getting on trains that aren't getting to where they need to go on time. That's what the next governor must focus on to change the course.
Thank you. Mr. Stefanowski.
Yeah, if we're going to attract business to our state, it might be a nice idea to have a business person running our state. When GE decided to leave, they went up and met with Charlie Baker. Charlie Baker advertised tax policy. He advertised skilled labor force. He advertised a stable tax regime that they could count on. When Dan Malloy went to meet with Jeff Immelt to talk about staying in Connecticut, in the last meeting, he puts a PowerPoint presentation on the table. And on the front page of the PowerPoint is a picture of a jet engine. Now, unfortunately, it's a Pratt & Whitney jet engine, not a GE jet engine. That's the end of the meeting. That would never happen in the private sector. Dan Malloy has been playing defense for too long. He waits for companies to threaten to leave, and then he tries to bribe them to stay. We need to start playing offense in this state. We need to create a tax policy, a regulatory policy that attracts companies to want to be here, that'll create jobs, and we can use that growth to cut the income tax.
Mr. Boughton, you get the final minute on this.
Yeah, no, I would just say that the example of the governor and his team showing the Pratt & Whitney engine on a PowerPoint is a perfect example of saying about respect. If you don't even know what a company does or how they do or what their products are, how can you possibly expect them to want to stay here in the state of Connecticut? Now look, unlike other folks here that are on the dais, I've actually done these things. The city of Danbury has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the state because we welcome business every day. We've opened an innovation center that encourages young people to start a business. We provide retirees to mentor those young people and help them develop business plans. We've done all those things, and because of that, Danbury has been ranked as one of the best cities, small cities, to start a business in. And we'll bring that same kind of attitude to the state of Connecticut. Businesses will be our friends, they'll be our partners in delivering services as well as being respected as employers for our residents.
Thank you, Mr. Boughton. Our next question begins with Mr. Obsitnik and will come from Christine.
Connecticut has several third parties and has elected a governor from third parties in the past. If you lose the primary, will you support the Republican nominee?
Absolutely, I will. I think that the misery that this state has seen over the last 8 years under Dan Malloy and the 40 years of democratically controlled legislatures in Hartford have taken us down a road to ruin for far too long. And it's time to change paths. So my path is the path of a kid who grew up in Stamford, who attended the U.S. Naval Academy, who did my service down the road in Groton. And when I found myself in times under the 10 feet under a 10,000-ton Russian submarine, you understand in life that there are more important things than self-interest and special interest. What matters in life is the mission that we're on. And so far, we've been led by special interest and self-interest. It's time for a real leader to step up, someone who's built 3 successful businesses, who knows what it takes to take risks to start a business and manage tens of thousands of people in projects and operations, like I did in the military and what I did in business. And take someone who has a vision that's going to pull the people together, not divide people over is there a state income tax or not. It's about 5 steps to 300,000 jobs over 8 years. Please join my path.
Mr. Stemmerman.
Christine, I most certainly would. While there are differences on this stage in a number of qualities, we all share the same goals of reducing taxes, reducing spending, balancing the budget, getting more jobs here, and those are underpinned by our shared Republican principles. And so I would support anyone here. The qualities that I would say set myself apart, I'd like to highlight. The first one is that I'm the only one on this stage that has a detailed plan of how we're going to achieve those goals. The second is I'm the only one who is truly independent. I don't owe anything to anyone. I started my own business. I'm not asking the government to fund my campaign, and I will fight only for the people of this state. And the last is it's important to bring everybody together, and that's your question. What we're looking for on primary day is not only someone who's going to win the governorship, but is going to bring a governing majority in both houses of the legislature. I'm committed to do that as your nominee or whoever it is.
Mr. Herbst.
Christine, I will absolutely support the winner of this primary, even if that person is not me. But there should have been a second part to your question. You should have asked each and every one of us if we would commit to stay with our party should we be elected to the office of governor. What I find incredibly troubling during the course of this campaign is that we have people on this dais who left the Republican Party 3 months before the 2016 election, did not vote in that election, and then became a Republican 1 month before they announced their candidacy for governor. That troubles me, because I did not find my value system in a poll or a focus group. I've been a Republican my entire life. I've voted in every election. When people say that they want to change what Dan Malloy has done over the course of the last 8 years, many of us were taking the fight to what's been going on in the state for a very long time when people weren't voting in elections for 16 years. I think it goes to the core of what's at stake in this campaign. The stakes have never been higher. And on August 14th, Republican primary voters need to elect a Republican who will remain a Republican and govern like a Republican.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Stefanowski, you have 1 minute.
To answer your question, yes, I will support the Republican candidate. I do think, and you can even tell by some of the responses, but people really don't want another politician to run this state. 90% of the people out there want somebody from the business world. I grew up in New Haven. I went to the public schools. I started at GE as an entry-level person. I became a senior executive in a company with 300,000 employees. I ran a business as CFO at UBS, a $500 billion balance sheet among 35 countries. The state of Connecticut is a $40 billion biannual budget. There's nobody, Dennis, on either side of the aisle that has run an organization anywhere near that size of the state. There's no one who is committed as firmly as I have to get rid of the state income tax and never raise taxes. There's no one who has a plan like I do to do it. There's no one who has the experience to do it, and it's exactly what we're going to deliver for the state.
Thank you. Mr. Boughton.
Yes, of course, I'll support whoever wins the nomination on Tuesday. You know, as a endorsed candidate for governor, I've been proud to travel all over the state of Connecticut talking to Republicans and spreading our message. I'll do the same if for some reason I'm not the endorsed candidate on the night of the 14th. But I also want to say that I've been a proud Republican my entire life, as was my father before me. I served on our local planning board. I served in the state legislature. I served as mayor. I earned the most prestigious award you can earn in the Republican Party, that of the Prescott Bush Award. I've done all of those things because I believe in Republican values, Republican principles. And when I was in the legislature and didn't miss a single vote, I stuck by my party time and time again when we were under siege from the Democrats and the far left. So I'll be there to support our party every time because I think it's important that we share people, that we can lead government with Republican values and Republican principles.
Mr. Obsitnik, you can have the final minute.
Just to close off on that, absolutely, again, I will support the Republican nominee. I've been a Republican all my life, but this election has to be about differences. I am the only real Republican business outsider on this stage. And we have great candidates up here. If you trust a career politician to fix the problems of a politician, you have two great choices up here. And if you want to trust two recovering Democrats, now as Republicans, you have your two options there. I am the only real business outsider Republican who served in the military here, grew up here, and created good, high-tech paying jobs. That's what you need behind your governor. And second of all, it is a detailed plan. It's a 5-step detailed plan at my website, steveobsitnik.com, to build 300,000 jobs over 8 years by harnessing together our academic institutions with our businesses, getting rid of regulations, targeted tax reform, $3.5 billion of detailed spending cuts. And ultimately, you deserve a leader to help turn the moving vans around, and I want to earn your vote to be that leader. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question begins with Mr. Stemmerman. In just a couple of weeks, a huge casino resort will open just over the Connecticut line in Springfield. It's expected to attract many customers from across Connecticut because it's closer to them than the casinos in eastern Connecticut. As governor, would you seek to expand legalized gambling in our state? And if so, where would you like to see new casinos?
So I think it's very important as we look at this, we look at it strategically and holistically. As you noted, when we first developed the compact with the tribes, and I've spent time with both of them, there was no competition. And now there is competition, both in Springfield and in Boston. And so we need to recognize that. We need to discuss with the tribes, are they able to make the investments they need to maintain employment in the eastern part of the state and grow? In addition, though, I see this as a tremendous opportunity to grow our gaming business. It can be grown in two different ways, both geographically, in different parts of the state, and by type of gaming. We've had a Supreme Court decision that gives the ability to have gaming for sports gaming and online as well. What I would look to do is I would look to sit down with the tribes who have been our partners and say, let's start with a clean sheet of paper. How can we work in partnership to do what is best for the state of Connecticut all across our state?
Thank you, Mr. Stemmer. Mr. Herbst.
Dennis, if I were to support an expansion of casino gambling in the state of Connecticut, I would insist upon the following. First, I would not want to compromise existing jobs by taking them from one section of the state and moving them to the other. I've been out to eastern Connecticut 150 times during the course of this campaign, and I see how important those jobs are to the economy in the 2nd District. But at the same time, I don't want those jobs to pick up in eastern Connecticut and move to another part of the state, displacing jobs and people by extension. Secondly, there are public ancillary costs that affect host communities that need to have greater sharing in terms of cost with the municipalities and the tribes. And finally, there needs to be a better recognition that the tribes need to put more skin in the game concerning licensing fees. If you look at the lack of licensing fees that they pay to the state compared to other states, in a state with a $5 billion budget deficit, we need to start doing this the way other states do, and that's why I believe competition is healthy, and I would insist that any expansion include all of that.
Thank you. Mr. Stefanowski.
Yeah, thank you. I think, unfortunately for us all, Dan Malloy has left us with such a mess with this economy. We can't rule out too many things. I think we could certainly look at expanding gambling and casinos in this state. I would view that the tribes have been pretty good partners. I know there's an emphasis on MGM in Bridgeport. We should look at that as well. But I think we need to take a balanced approach to trying to grow those revenues while keeping it under control. I will go back to, that's not going to be a game changer for the state. What is going to be a game changer for the state is lowering taxes, reducing the size of government, getting rid of this state income tax. But the gaming industry is a great example of ancillary revenues we can bring in to help subsidize some of these costs, use that to give it back to the people of Connecticut, and actually start to grow our economy again. That's what we need to do, Dennis.
Mr. Boughton.
I think before we begin a discussion about where to locate another casino, we ought to have a discussion about what is the best path forward in terms of gaming in general. And I think we need a comprehensive study to be able to do that. We can't rely on a tribe study. We can't rely on MGM study. We need to go out and understand what the marketplace is right now in terms of gaming to make sure that we can get the best revenue possible from whatever decisions we make. Think about what the legislature has done. They've implemented Keno. By the way, nobody in the legislature would actually admit that they implemented Keno, and you still can't find somebody who actually authored the bill. Everybody says, I don't know where it came from, but yet in Danbury, we have 72 locations for Keno. In addition to that, we have Lotto, we have scratch-offs, and now we have Sportsbook, which is something we should look at. All these things come together to form a pile of money. We ought to have an understanding of where that all lays out and what's best for the residents of our state. I'd also tell you that the Native American tribes have had too many compacts, too many agreements broken over the last 300 years, and they must be part of the solution in terms of what happens to gaming in Connecticut.
Mr. Obsitnik.
Yeah, look, politicians will talk about another study. Let me talk about what I believe from my military and business experience. Life to me is not about transactions, it's about relationships. And when I spend time living in Groton and serving in the submarine force, when EB started having problems, it was the casinos and the tribes that took people and transformed their skills to the gaming industry. Now that EB is growing and the casinos are having problems, I think we have to remember that relationship and that commitment to our state. That being said, I believe in my 5-step plan to building 300,000 jobs over 8 years. I don't gamble personally. I'd love to have high-tech jobs like that woman Siri I was involved with here in Connecticut. That being said, if somebody wants to invest $700 million in this state, be it the tribes or someone else, I will listen to that because we need investment in this state to get our cities growing, solve our infrastructure problem so that people can live here with dignity once again.
Mr. Stemmerman, the final word on this.
Yes. So I actually want to give you a little more insight of what's possible here. So as I talked about, I ran my own business, and one of the areas that we invested in was in gaming. And what I got to see, both in Las Vegas and all over the world, is it's not just gaming. When there's a vision behind it, you bring entertainment and you bring convention space, it can be a major economic driver. I proposed in one of the plans on our website something called Bridgeport Vision 2028. And in that vision, we're going to bring the train there in 45 minutes. We're going to add lanes to 95, and we're going to bring commercial airport with private investment. We're seeing private investment in Bridgeport at Steel Point Harbor, where private investment is bringing in 200-boat marina there. There's a resurgence there. I see a very important role for this kind of a complex to be developed in Bridgeport. It can take advantage of the Webster Bank Arena there. It can be a great venue. It can be part of revitalizing that city for the next generation.
All right, next question begins with Mr. Herbst. It comes from Angela.
How would you respond to the idea that by not installing tolls, Connecticut is essentially leaving money on the table by not having out-of-state motorists who drive through the state and pay tolls all around us, not contributing to paying to the wear and tear of our roads and bridges?
I would say that what Hartford has demonstrated time and again is the more revenue you give them, the more they will find a way to misappropriate it. Citizens of the state of Connecticut were told that the gas tax and the concomitant increases to that tax would fund our infrastructure. We were told that when we put the income tax in, we wouldn't have budget deficits again. I don't trust the Hartford insiders to make sure that toll money goes to funding our highways, roads, and bridges. I should also point out that when we eliminated tolls in the 80s, we received federal funding. Nobody has shown a cost-benefit analysis of what we would generate in tolls minus what we could potentially lose in federal funding. Here's what needs to happen. There needs to be a forensic audit of the Special Transportation Fund. We need to stop raiding the Special Transportation Fund to artificially balance the budget. These are the things that need to happen and will happen if I am elected governor. And we need to focus on priorities. 95, 91, the Merritt Parkway, Metro North, Shoreline East. We don't need to spend tens of millions of dollars on a busway to nowhere from New Britain to Hartford that no one uses.
Mr. Stefanowski.
Thank you. Well, first of all, a toll is it's just another tax. And I'm one of two people on the stage here today that has signed a written pledge to never raise taxes. So it's never going to happen in my administration. I think the fact is you can't trust the government to do what they say they will with the money. The fact that you have to create a lockbox because the government can't trust themselves is unique in and of itself. And then it's even more unique when the general fund gets depleted, they raid the lockbox. It's a classic example of government dysfunction. If we were to put the tolls near the borders, we lose federal funding. So what we would end up is with congestion pricing and more taxes on the people of Connecticut. And what does Dan Malloy do as his parting gift after the legislature has spoken and the people have spoken that they don't want tolls? He signs up for a $10 million study, quote, only $10 million to do a toll study. Think of what we could be doing with that money. That's why we need to start running this state like a business, not like a charity.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Boughton, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I've been clear that I would strap myself to I-84 before I let a single toll be put in this state. And the reason for that is that it really amounts to a $700 million tax for the middle class. There's already been studies done after studies done. And by the way, spending $10 million on a study is absolutely absurd when we've already done 3 studies prior to this. So we understand what it's going to cost and how to deploy this, and nobody wants to, frankly, pull the trigger. Even during the last legislative session, the legislature tried to get that decision out of them, something they're paid to do, and have this commission decide whether or not that we have tolls. And let me tell you something else. When you hear the term lockbox, watch your wallet. That means that they're going to figure out a way to get around it and intercept the revenue. Remember, the lotto was supposed to go and pay for education. Remember the constitutional spending cap that was supposed to cap our income tax. All of those things have not worked out the way they said, so be very careful. And finally, I can tell you one thing. This governor will get the welcome centers open in the state of Connecticut.
Mr. Boughton, thank you. Mr. Obsitnik, you have 1 minute.
Look, I think we all stand shoulder to shoulder on this. Whenever we've sent more money to Hartford, we know what happens. It goes for some other political pet project, and we cannot live with that. We put $1.5 billion into our special transportation fund. The legislature has stolen over time $400 million out because they didn't have the courage to keep funding our roads and bridges, number one. Number two, the federal subsidy, no one has showed us what that would be to replace what we would be bringing in tolls. Number three, the state of Massachusetts, 1/3 of all their taxes come from out-of-state people. So I think people and politicians are lying to the people of Connecticut to what the true benefit is going to be economically. And what I would say is we had a saying in the Navy, it's not what you expect, it's what you inspect. And we have to do a lot more inspecting here in the state of Connecticut. Why does it cost $450,000 for us to build a mile of road and the rest of the nation $180,000? Why is it 3 times more expensive? So I'm not going to take 1 more cent until we inspect state government a lot more and keep money in your pocket so you can build your family and retire in Connecticut. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stemmerman.
So it's a critical question here of how we're going to repair our transportation infrastructure. As I drive all around this state, people are stuck in traffic all the time, and our trains are slower today than 1970. And while I've heard on the stage what they're against, I haven't heard what they're for. And what I think is critical for leadership is to propose solutions. And what we've proposed is to attract billions of dollars of private investment. And I know that we can do this because my business, Canadas Capital, we own the shares of companies that invested in these billion-dollar projects, multi-billion-dollar projects for airports, roads, and trains all over the world. And not only all over the world, increasingly in this country. If you go to Florida, the roads are in great shape because they've been brought in by public-private partnerships. And I'm talking to the guy who advised Governor Jeb Bush to do it. If you go to LaGuardia Airport, which has been under disrepair for decades, how is it being rebuilt? A private-public partnership. Your leadership needs to identify not just problems, but solutions, and that's what I'll do.
Mr. Herbst, you have 1 minute rebuttal here.
The state of Connecticut doesn't need to spend $10 million on a study to tell them what they should already know. We have a spending problem in how we prioritize our infrastructure projects. What nobody seems to talk about in Hartford is how this DOT commissioner has increased operational encumbrances to the tune of 62% over the last 8 years. We were told in the last legislative session that if we increased the sales tax 0.5% and didn't cap bonding, that we would be able to fund $4 billion in infrastructure projects. 3 months later, the governor announced the cancellation of those $4 billion in infrastructure projects. So beyond investing in critical needs of the state of Connecticut, I want to make sure that we appoint a DOT commissioner that clearly understands that the priority projects need to be those that ease traffic congestion, make it easier for people to get to and from work, and invest in our infrastructure in a meaningful way which encourages private business investment and other businesses in other states to come here. I don't want to do anything that's going to put an additional financial burden on our residents and compromise our economic development capabilities.
Thank you. Christine has our next question, beginning with Mr. Stefanowski.
Connecticut was the first state in the nation in 2010 to expand its Medicaid program under the Affordable Care Act. Would you continue to support Medicaid expansion, or would you change it?
I think we should move towards a private sector model. I mean, unfortunately, it seems like Obamacare is here to stay. We do get a fair amount of federal support, but we need to start working with what we can control in this state. We should allow more choice. Right now, our residents can only pick Connecticut plans. There's multiple plans throughout the country that are infinitely better than what we have here. We need to create more choice. We should not be forcing people to take insurance. I firmly believe in the supply and the demand of the private market. We need to work with the pharmaceutical companies. We need to work with the physicians to get the cost down. We need to stop the increasing level of drug prescription and bring that down. There are a ton of things that we can do to control the cost of healthcare in this state, but I firmly believe the private sector and choice for the citizens of our state is the way to go, not mandates and things being forced down on people by our government.
I just want to be clear, this is specifically about Medicaid expansion, so when we come back.
Mr. Boughton?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things we should be doing is privatizing our Medicaid program. We're one of only 2 states in the United States of America that doesn't have a private approach, a privatized approach, and yet we're the an insurance capital of the world in many ways. So the fact that we're not leveraging state businesses to be able to deliver those services even for our own residents is kind of absurd and silly, and that's part of the reason why our state government cost continues to escalate. Certainly on the expansion side, it'll depend on what the numbers are. The devil is always in the details on these things, and if you're taking on a larger role in that particular arena and that there's no guarantee that those funds will be there in the future, then I would have some serious reservations about expanding that particular program. And I want to just echo that we also need choice in the marketplace. I've heard horror stories from people whose premiums have gone up $2,000, $3,000 because there's only one provider or two providers or however many providers are available at that moment.
Mr. Psitnik.
Yeah, look, I think the way we deal with expansion is we build more jobs. We get people into the private sector where you have private health care plans for people. And that's why I focus on building 300,000 jobs with the voters of Connecticut. Second of all, when we look at Medicaid, we spend about $2.9 billion a year. Medicaid spending is expected to go up. I just think we haven't been very innovative as a state, and we need a leader who's going to innovate. We are one of the only state in the nation who self-administers our Medicaid program. Everyone else uses a third-party administrator, and it's been shown that you can bring about up to 20–25% efficiency gains. That's $500 million of savings, which to me is a big number as a small business owner. It should be, I'm sure it is to the listeners out there. We need to apply that discipline to Medicaid. We need to then be more innovative, like states like Indiana and Massachusetts, who've worked around CMS 1115 waivers so we can control more of our cost structure. So in effect, you can bring more choice into the solution. But it starts with building more jobs and giving people more opportunity outside of Medicaid.
Mr. Stemmerman.
Christine, this is a very important question because as we think about having a society in which there's a decent life for everybody here, having access to health care is important for everybody. The second thing that is quite important is to make sure that the quality of that care is as good as it can be. And the third thing is to make sure that it's not consuming too much of our budget deficit. Not surprisingly, I view that having a more private sector-oriented approach here is the right one. One of the first actions that our governor took when he came into office was to take a private sector-oriented plan and have it being run by the government. This is an area where I invested in quite a bit, and I understand how managed care in the past hasn't done much about managing care, but we have some of the leading managed care companies in the country here, and I believe working collaboratively with them, we can have our cake and eat it too, meaning we can offer higher quality care with preventative care and do it at a lower cost. The last thing is it's important that we only provide this care to those who are in need, and we need to be very careful about eligibility for this program.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst.
Christine, when you talk about Medicaid expansion, I would agree with some of the previous comments. I do not believe the state should self-administer. I think we should privatize certain areas. I think we should look to the free market to create the type of competition that provides affordable and quality care for our residents. Let me just say this, though. When we look at all of the entitlement programs in our state, I think it's the obligation of a governor to make sure that those people who need it can receive it. And if you look to expand it, you have to make sure you can pay for it. And I think one of the things the next governor needs to do is make sure that programs like Medicaid, and whether we expand it, are helping those that truly need it, and at the same time making sure that people are not taking advantage of the system and perhaps as it relates to other entitlement programs. So I'm the only candidate in this race that I said that I will appoint an Inspector General of the state of Connecticut. I will ask the legislature to give that individual subpoena power, and I will ask that individual to make sure that those that are using any entitlement programs in the state need it, and that there isn't any waste, fraud, or abuse going on with any of the programs within our state.
Mr. Herbst, thank you. Mr. Stefanowski, you have 1 minute for rebuttal.
Thank you. If you look at the data, we get about $2.8 billion in federal funding for Medicaid, and the problem is we can't assume that that's going to continue, which gets back to what I think everybody is saying is the private sector is going to be much better at doing this. But I go back to the real problem in this state, which is a lack of jobs. If we can get this economy moving, if we can get taxes down, if we can get corporations to start to come back here, we won't have to pay as much on entitlements as we do today. We need to have more accountability around it. We need to protect people that need the protection, but we also need to have accountability. And the right way to get us out of this mess that we're in is not more entitlements. It's driving job growth, it's creating more disposable income, and it's giving people hope that this state is actually going to start to turn itself around. And that's what we're going to do as the next governor.
All right. Our next question will begin with Mr. Boughton, and it comes from Angela.
What would your response be as governor if the U.S. Supreme Court were to overturn Roe versus Wade, as some believe could happen? Would you leave Connecticut's abortion rights law as it is, or would you call for changes in it and try to impose restrictions in line with such a ruling?
Well, I would say, first of all, that this would, in many ways, sort of be something that the Democrats would try to play up during the general election to get us not talking about the failures of the Malloy administration. But to answer your question, Angela.
It's a legitimate question. I mean, if you want to be governor, you may be faced with that.
I'm going to answer it. I personally am pro-life. However, I believe strongly that government should not get between a woman and her doctor. So what that means is that the status quo for me is just fine. It's settled law, and it's also part of our statutory scheme here in the state of Connecticut. I wouldn't push to overturn, or if it was remanded back to the states, push for any kind of legislation surrounding this. This is a decision that has to be made by the woman, her family, as well as the doctor as to what's the best and in the best interest for the woman.
Mr. Obsitnik.
Yeah, like the mayor, I agree. I do not stand between a woman or a person and their care provider. And our state constitution is firm in what those rules are, regardless of what happens at a federal level. I think the reality, though, is that this is an important topic, but it's going to be a topic that Ned Lamont is going to want to talk about because the facts are not on the side of Dan Malloy and Ned Lamont. And they're going to obfuscate what I talk to when I've talked to thousands of people at their doors. They talk about the cost of living, taxation, how their kids can't move back here. This is not an issue which is top of mind with the people that I've been talking to. What they want is a governor who's going to lead again and inspire us to be the state we can, because we have all the assets here. We have the bones. We've just been held in a headlock for the last 8 years. And we need a governor who's going to culturally hug the customers of Connecticut around targeted tax reform, detailed spending cuts, building career corridors so people can afford to stay in Connecticut and build a family here. That's what I'm hearing out there.
Mr. Stemmerman.
So my wife and I have 5 children, so on this issue personally, I think the numbers speak for themselves. In terms of what I think we should be doing as a state, I think that this is not an area that the government should be interfering. And so I think it's quite unrealistic that there's going to be any change even with the developments on the Supreme Court. But even if there were, there is a clear will of the people that's been passed in legislation, and I wouldn't seek to change it. One thing that I think is very important to understand, though, is that if there is an unwanted or unplanned pregnancy, that we need to be there as a state for everyone. We need to be there for the mother. We need to be there for the child. And there's a lot that a governor can do, whether it be in foster care, whether it be in adoption services, to make sure that there is a place for every child, every life that we would treasure in our state.
Mr. Herbst.
I think it's significant to note that the decision in Roe was reaffirmed by the Supreme Court in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992 by what was then a very conservative court. In the event that the Supreme Court were to overturn Roe, what Ned Lamont doesn't like to tell people is that in 1992, the Connecticut General Assembly passed a law which codified the essential holding of Roe, which is part of the Connecticut General Statutes. So this is a pro-choice state. Notwithstanding my faith and my personal beliefs, this is a pro-choice state. That being said, if I'm elected governor, I will support efforts to put laws on the books that allow for parental consent and parental notification for this reason. When I look at states that are bluer than Connecticut, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, that have stronger parental consent laws, I think it is high time that we have parental consent in the state of Connecticut. If a minor has to contact their parent to take an aspirin at school or to get a body piercing, they should have to contact and speak with their parent if they're going to get an abortion.
Mr. Stefanowski, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, so he kind of stole some of my thunder there, but it is codified in Connecticut law, and I do think the Democrats are going to try to push the discussion, and this election needs to be laser focused on the economy. They don't want to talk about the economy because you cannot support what Dan Malloy has done for the last 8 years. Along with the other candidates, I've got a 15-year-old daughter. I took her to get her ears pierced a few months ago, and I had to sign a form. The fact that she could go get an abortion without parental notification, to me, is unacceptable. We need to put a bill in on parental notification. A young person should have people that they can talk to. But again, we cannot get distracted by something that's already codified in Connecticut law. We need to start talking about the economy. We need to start talking about jobs. We need to start talking about what's really on people's minds out there. And that's what this campaign has been focused on, cutting taxes.
Mr. Boughton, the final word on this.
Yeah, I would say that I taught high school for 14 years, and in all my years of teaching, I never saw a bad child. I saw bad parents, I saw maybe a bad teacher, a bad situation, and a bad living conditions for the child, but there's goodness that rests within each of us. So when we talk about this issue, it's why I consider myself to be pro-life in the sense that I'm supportive of the child. Certainly, we as a government in the state of Connecticut ought to put our efforts in providing options for those people that are facing that kind of circumstance aside from abortion. Our foster care system is a mess. We've had deaths that recently occurred because computer systems couldn't talk to each other and because we weren't sure where our students are or where our children are. And finally, I would say that we need to have a government that supports the families of this state, that encourages family growth and family development, that takes the pressure off of families to be able to interact with one another and to stay together at all costs.
All right, our next question from Christine goes to Mr. Obsitnik.
Mr. Obsitnik, school choice has a wide variety of champions, from Governor Malloy to Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. It also has its share of detractors. Where do you stand?
Look, I think we already have school choice in this state. It's called moving. And we have people, 100 people a day, move out of Connecticut. They've made a choice that this isn't the state that they either grew up in or have opportunity here. So we have some great school districts in this state that do well. Those school districts, I think, should be continued to let do what they do. I do believe that we can look at strengthening standards on children and teachers. Massachusetts has had a model around this, and they've done incredibly well in their K-12 progress over Connecticut. In areas where we do have problems, I'm all for innovation. I'm for looking at vouchers and school choice, because what bothers me is when we have children who are left decade after decade in environments that don't give them the opportunity to strive forward. Because we are a state of gaps, and we've got to recognize that. We have an achievement gap, we have a skills gap, and we have an income gap. If we don't do a better job of educating all of our children of Connecticut, we will continue to be a state of gaps.
Mr. Stemmerman.
I believe in the promise of the American dream, which is that with hard work, every generation does better than the last. And in a competitive 21st century economy, that's only realistic if everyone has access to a good school. My father was the first one in his family to go to college. He went to public school in Elmira, New York. And my grandfather on the other side, he grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and it was the same thing. The best way that I think we can achieve this is by having a student-centered funding formula, which means that every family will have a voice and a choice of where they send their child to school. And the dollars will then follow that child to the school of their choice, whether it be the local neighborhood school, a charter school, a career and technical school, or a magnet school. We now have different funding formulas, 11 different ones. It doesn't make any sense. And so a place like Amistad Academy, which is doing a wonderful job in New Haven, educating children, is not able to accept new students. Under my plan, the market would do the job, and every child would have the chance to go to the school of their choice.
Mr. Herbst.
I'm proud to be the son of public school teachers, one that taught in a suburb, one that taught in an urban center. And I remember growing up hearing about the achievement gap and what we had to do to close that achievement gap. And now as an adult, I can look at our state and say that we have an achievement gap that has not closed, and we have disparity that must be addressed. And as governor of the state of Connecticut, I will work to close the achievement gap by doing the following: reforming the educational cost-sharing formula, making sure that that formula is rooted in the fundamental principles of accountability and basic fairness, supporting school choice like charters if it makes sense for the child, investing in magnet schools, and recognizing that it's not just money, but it's about working as a community together and making sure that we lift up those that need help the most. This achievement gap has been talked about for 20 years, and we haven't closed it. And there needs to be a recognition by the next governor that if we're going to close that achievement gap, it will include school choice, but it will include local and state officials working together to lift everybody up.
Mr. Stefanowski.
Yeah, so my dad went to Hill House High School in New Haven. My mom went to St. Mary's. They never went to college, but they saw the value of an education. I went to North Haven High School, and I went right out of there to work for Price Waterhouse. Education is one of the fundamental bedrocks of freedom in this country, and we need to support it. We do need to have school choice. We do need to have smaller class sizes. We do need to invest more in teachers. We need to run some of these schools with a bit more of private discipline models, pay for performance, outcomes-based teaching. We need to lower the cost of a college education. We need to reinvest in our trade schools. There are a ton of medium-sized businesses in this state that are dying for kids with basic engineering skills, machine tooling. The $200,000 investment on a college education is not for everyone. We need to start moving kids to where they're supposed to be and gaining skill sets that they can get jobs and start to build a life for themselves in our state.
Mr. Boughton.
I mean, the opposition to school choice really heightens or shows the absurdity of having a school down the street that is successful and your child can't go and has to go to an unsuccessful school far away because we won't recognize the fact that private schools can in many cases do as good a job, if not better, than the public school system. I have a master's degree in educational psychology. I was a public schools teacher for 14 years, and never once did I think that was I ever afraid of competition in that particular area. In Danbury, we've opened a STEM academy, we've opened a magnet school, we've opened and now working on a charter school to provide the parents and families choice of where they want their child to go. We have about 200 kids, new students that show up every year needing an education. That's a full elementary school. So we've had to be incredibly creative to be able to provide opportunities and choice to our parents. And finally, let me just say there's been discussion about the achievement gap. Technology is there's a technology gap that is a huge driver of that, and we have a plan to be able to close that technology gap amongst all of Connecticut students.
Thank you. Mr. Sitnick, final word here.
My mom was a Waterford, Connecticut school teacher. She met my dad at the submarine base when he was stationed there, and I'm a product of the Stanford Public School Systems, and a system that has served this state very well. Coming from the private sector, I'm all for how we use more innovation to make sure people aren't left behind, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. For example, a good example is our community college or our private trade schools. Right now, Rhode Island has something called the Rhode Island Promise. For every $1 of Pell Grants that Connecticut is able to get for a Connecticut student, Rhode Island gets $2.50. Why are they able to get 2.5 times more fighting for the citizens of Connecticut? So we need more innovation in K-12. We need more innovation in our community colleges. I will fight under my plan to build 300,000 jobs, that we have a trained workforce, retrain a workforce of people my age and others, because that's another issue that I see. The people who are 50 and 60 right now who cannot get a job, and we are still able-bodied, and we should work on that as well.
Thank you. Now our rapid-fire segment. We'll begin with Mr. Stemmerman. Is any one of your fellow candidates unfit to be Republican nominee?
No.
No.
Mr. Stefanowski?
No.
No.
Marijuana is going to be a big issue next session. How would you characterize your marijuana use in your life? Never, tried it, regular?
Tried it.
Tried it in college.
Tried it.
Never should, but maybe I should.
Never.
Rhode Island just passed a ban on driving with headphones. Should Connecticut pass a similar ban? Mr. Stefanowski?
I mean, common sense would say you shouldn't, but I wouldn't legislate it.
Mr. Bowden?
Yes.
I'd have to think about it, but probably yes.
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 Who was the best governor in the last 50 years, Mr. Bowden?
Ella Grasso.
Mitch Daniels, Indiana.
In Connecticut, I'm talking.
Oh, in Connecticut? Ella Grasso.
None.
Tom Meskel.
I thought Jody Rowell had some positive qualities, show what leadership can do.
Republican candidate for Lieutenant Governor Joe Markley could be your running mate. He voted against the Pay Equity Act. Do you support that vote? Mr. Sitnick?
I support equal pay for equal work, man or woman.
Agreed.
Equal pay for equal work.
Agreed.
Equal pay for equal work.
Should Connecticut ban plastic bags? We'll begin with Mr. Stemmerman.
No.
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 Do you do your own posting on social media, or does someone do it for you? Mr. Herbst?
Both.
I do a little bit of each, but some of it is someone else.
Up to the campaign started, I did my own. Now we share it.
Yeah, both. I try to do most of it, but we share it.
I leave it mostly to the professionals.
Would you want President Trump to campaign with you here in Connecticut? Mr. Stefanowski?
Absolutely. I think what he's done for this national economy, we could use some of that here in Connecticut.
Mr. Bowden?
Sure, we'd welcome him to the state of Connecticut.
Military veteran, I would support the Commander-in-Chief. He's always welcome here.
Absolutely yes.
Absolutely yes.
Do you support the legalization of marijuana, Mr. Bowden?
I have reservations about it right now, so I'm a no.
Likewise, reservations of doing it safely and making sure the economics actually work for the state.
No.
Personally opposed, put it on the ballot.
Mr. Stefanowski?
We need a test for driving impairment before we look at legalizing it.
Should Connecticut ban 3D printable untraceable guns? Mr. Bowden?
That issue is really a First Amendment issue, so I think we need to study the issue a little bit further, and we got to wait for the federal government to act.
Mr. Sitnick?
Federal law requires every gun to have a serial number. If it complies with that, I have no problem with it, but every gun has to have a serial number.
Mr. Stemmerman?
Federal law has dealt with this.
Federal law dealt with this in 1988.
Federal law should apply.
Would you hire a convicted felon to serve in your administration? Mr. Bowden?
That would depend on the nexus of what that person did and how old they were and how much time has passed between their conviction and their current age.
Mr. Obsitnik.
Agreed. I believe in second chance for people, but it depends on the situation.
Mr. Stemmerman.
Fact specific.
Agree with everything that's been previously said. I don't think we need a convicted felon as our governor.
Mr. Stefanowski.
I think it depends on the situation and the role.
That wraps up today's debate. We want to thank our viewers for watching and contributing some questions. Thanks to our panelists, Angela Dias of WTIC and Christine Stewart of CTNewsJunkie.com. Don't forget, you can still register to vote. Even if you are an unaffiliated voter, you can register to vote in the Democrat or Republican primary. Online deadline is this week and in person next week. Thank you to the candidates Bob Stefanowski, Mark Boughton, Steve Obsitnik, David Stemmerman, and Tim Herbst.